Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Most Americans know Social Security, but if you've ever worked for the railroad, your retirement looks very different, and in some ways, much better. The railroad retirement system is its own completely separate federal pension plan. It's got its own funding, its own benefits formula, and its own rules on when you can retire. Perhaps you've heard rumors like, you can retire at 60 with full benefits, and that's true, but there's a lot more to it. So today we're going to do a deep dive on this system, start to finish. How it's funded, how you pay in, who qualifies, what those benefits look like, how safe the system is, and how it stacks up against Social Security. So let's dive in. Let's start at the very beginning. Funding. The railroad retirement is built on a two-tier system. Tier 1 looks just like Social Security. Both employees and employers pay 6.2% on wages up to the 2025 cap of $176,100, plus the 1.45% Medicare tax on all earnings. Tier 2 is where things change. Employees pay an extra 4.9% and employers pay a much larger 13.1%, but only on the first $130,800 of wages. That extra Tier 2 is what funds the pension portion of the railroad retirement. You can think of Tier 1 as being the equivalent of Social Security, and then Tier 2 layers on top as a private pension. Let's make this real with an example. Say we have a railroad worker making $150,000. For the Tier 1 contributions, essentially the Social Security equivalent, both the employee and the employer would pay 6.2%. In this case, both parties would pay $9,300. Then we look at the Tier 2 contributions. This is the pension layer. The employee pays 4.9%, in this case about $6,400, and the employer pays 13.1%. on the first $130,800 of wages, in this case a little bit over $17,000. Just like in other career fields, Medicare contributions apply to all wages. So when we put this all together, looking at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Medicare contributions, coming just from the employee, it'd be just under $18,000. From the employer, about $28,700. In total, between both the employee and the employer, they pay over $46,000 into the system. For that rail employee making $150,000 in 2025. And remember, these are pre-tax payroll taxes, so they come out before income tax calculations are done, just like in any other career field when it comes to Social Security or Medicare. Since 2001, all of those Tier 2 contributions have been invested through the National Railroad Retirement Investment Trust. Unlike Social Security, which only invests in treasuries, this trust uses a diversified mix of stocks and bonds, private equity, and even real estate. And it's done well. In 2023 alone, the trust experienced a 12% net return, going from $23 billion in assets to $24 billion. And that's after paying out $1.4 billion in benefits. And long term, the trust has averaged a 9% rate of return, exceeding the set benchmark of 8%. And there's a built-in safety valve with this system. If assets dip too low, those Tier 2 rates can adjust to keep the system solvent. So the system isn't just paying out more, it's also investing wisely to keep strong long-term benefits. So let's take a moment to talk about that built-in safety valve, something that Social Security doesn't have. And every year, actuaries measure the health level of the railroad retirement trust funds. And if these funds are ever deemed to have dipped too low, those Tier 2 rates automatically adjust. So this means the employers would kick in a greater percentage on payroll. And in theory, the employees would too as well, except employees are already at their max rate. Right now, employees pay a steady 4.9% and employers pay 13.1%. The employer rate has moved slightly over time, but it's held steady at its current rate since 2013 because the fund performance has been strong enough that we don't need an additional surcharge. But if the fund ever struggled, the employer rate could raise all the way up to 22%. It's a stabilizer that ensures that benefits keep flowing without waiting for Congress to act. But thus far, the fund performance has been strong enough that they haven't needed emergency hikes. Now, not everyone who works a railroad job ends up with a railroad retirement. To qualify, or in pension terms, to vest, you need enough railroad service. The rule is 10 years of total railroad service, 120 months, or at least 5 years if all of that service was after 1995. Once you reach that threshold, you're officially vested, so that means you and your family qualify for railroad retirement benefits once you reach retirement age, instead of Social Security. Now here's some context. That 10-year vesting rule only applies to workers prior to 1995, and since that was nearly 30 years ago, the vast majority of workers today are going to fall under the 5-year vesting period. But what if you don't hit those vesting limits? If you work less than 5 years following the year 1995, they automatically get transferred over to Social Security. That way, your years spent working for the railroad system still count towards building up your Social Security benefit. You don't lose credit for the work you did, it just gets counted in the Social Security system instead of the railroad retirement system. But that's only your Tier 1 contributions that roll over into Social Security. Your Tier 2 contributions do not carry over. Since Tier 2 is paying into the railroad-only pension system, if you don't wait for the full vesting period, those full 5 years, you do lose what you've paid in. Essentially, it just stays in the system and gets paid out to other retirees. There is no refund. So if you don't meet those vesting requirements, that money is lost. Let's do a non-vested example. Suppose you worked 4 years for a railroad, earning $60,000 a year. You'd have paid just under $3,000 a year in Tier 2 taxes, or roughly $12,000 total over the course of 4 years. Your employer would have contributed even more, about $31,400 total. If you leave before vesting, all of that Tier 2 money stays in the system. You won't see any sort of refund, and you won't inevitably collect any Tier 2 benefits down the road. Your Tier 1 contributions would be rolled over and credited to your Social Security record and would help to increase those benefits one day when you start collecting Social Security. Now let's do an example of a worker with 7 years of service as a railroad employee. So they're fully vested because all of those years are post-1995. That means when they retire, they'll receive Tier 1 benefits equivalent to Social Security plus Tier 2 pension benefits based on those 7 years of railroad service. The key takeaway is that this vesting period matters. For the vast majority of workers today, because they're post-1995, the 5-year vesting rule is what's going to apply. If you have less than 5 years, you will be credited the equivalent in the Social Security system. However, if you stay longer than 5 years, you would qualify for benefits under the railroad retirement system, both Tier 1 and Tier 2. Now, what about retirement ages? Here's where the railroad retirement gets interesting. For most workers, the earliest you can claim the railroad retirement is age 62, just like Social Security. But there is one major exception. If you have at least 30 years of railroad service, you can claim full benefits completely unrestricted and unreduced by the age of 60. That's what railroaders call the 60-30 rule. The railroad retirement system does have a full retirement age, just like Social Security, and for today's workers, it's based on your birth year, so it's either usually 66 or 67. If you claim benefits before full retirement age and you don't qualify for an exception through the 60-30 rule, your benefits will experience a reduction. Let's say your full retirement age is 67 and you decide to claim at 62. Your Tier 1 benefits will experience a reduction of about 30%, similar to Social Security. Your Tier 2 benefits, that pension portion, will also experience an actuarial reduction based on claiming prior to your full retirement age. But if you qualify under that 60-30 rule, 30 years of service, and at least age 60, then both Tier 1 and Tier 2 are paid in full, no reduction. Full retirement age doesn't matter in that case. Now, you can leave the railroad industry at any age, but you can't start collecting your railroad retirement until you hit those minimum ages, 60 if you have 30 full years of service or 62 if you don't. Some workers do leave the railroad early and decide to take other jobs, but just know you can't file for those retirement benefits until you hit those milestones. The railroad retirement also has a disability provision. If you are totally disabled at any age, you may qualify for a disability annuity similar to Social Security disability insurance, but the railroad retirement system adds another provision, occupational disability. With 20 years of service, or just 10 years if you're already 60 or older, you can still qualify for disability benefits if you can no longer perform your specific railroad task, even if you can work a job outside of the railroad industry. Social Security doesn't offer a benefit like this. What if you want to claim your benefits but also keep working? You have to pay attention to the earnings limit. If you are under full retirement age, outside earnings can reduce your Tier 1 benefits. In 2025, the earnings limit is $23,400. For every $2 you earn above that limit, $1 in Tier 1 benefits is withheld. If you reach full retirement age during 2025, that limit increases to just over $62,000, and at which point $1 would be withheld for every $3 earned above that threshold, until the month where full retirement age is met. This rule applies even if you retired early under the 60-30 rule. Yes, you're entitled to full and unrestricted benefits if you had 30 years of service and were at least 60 years old, but you are still subject to the earnings limit until you reach full retirement age for your Tier 1 benefits. Once you hit your full retirement age, which is either 66 or 67, depending on your birth year, you qualify for unrestricted benefits. You can earn as much as you want without your Tier 1 benefits being reduced. Importantly, you cannot keep working for the railroad service and collect your railroad retirement. You have to completely separate from the railroad before your annuity can begin. Let's do two examples. Railroader A, who has 32 years of service. He retires at the age of 60. Because of the 60-30 rule, he receives full unrestricted Tier 1 and Tier 2 benefits immediately. Full retirement age does not apply here. Railroader B has 27 years of service. He decides to retire at age 62, but because they don't meet the 30-year rule, full retirement age does apply. With their full retirement age being 67, if they decide to claim at 62, their Tier 1 benefit is cut about 30%, and the Tier 2 is also reduced for early retirement. To avoid reductions, they'd need to wait to claim until full retirement age. So here's the bottom line. With 30 or more years of service, you can retire at the age of 60 and receive full Tier 1 and Tier 2 benefits completely unrestricted. If you retire with less than 30 years of service, the earliest you can claim is age 62, at which point both Tier 1 and Tier 2 benefits would be subject to reduction. If you wait until full retirement age, there would be no reduction. Also, disability provisions and occupational disability can provide earlier options if health forces you out. And once you're collecting, you can work elsewhere, but not in the railroad industry, with earnings limits applying only until full retirement age. Now let's talk about how these benefits themselves are created. As we've said, the railroad retirement is made up of two layers. Tier 1 essentially follows the same formula as Social Security, and it is calculated based on your combined earnings from any railway and non-railway jobs. Now, normally, Social Security looks at your highest 35 years of earnings, averages them into your AIME, or your average indexed monthly earnings, and then applies the bend point formula that replaces lower earnings at a higher percentage and higher earnings at a lower percentage. They also adjust for the cost of living and look at whether you claimed early or qualify for delayed credits. But here's an important difference for railroaders. If you only worked in the railroad industry for, say, 30 years, you wouldn't get penalized with 5 years of zeros the way you would with Social Security. Instead, those 30 years would be treated as a full record for your Tier 1 benefits, so your Tier 1 benefits wouldn't get watered down with any zeros. After that calculation is done, Tier 1 functions just like Social Security, and looking at whether you claimed early, receiving a reduced benefit, or whether you're entitled to delayed retirement credits. You might think of this as your baseline Social Security check within the railroad retirement system. And if you'd like a deeper dive on specifically how Social Security benefits are calculated, I have a full video that goes over it, and I will link it above and down below if you're interested. Tier 2 is the pension layer. This is unique to the railroad industry, and its formula is pretty straightforward. 0.7% times average monthly railroad earnings when we average the top 5 years of earnings and multiply that by the number of years of railroad service. Unlike Tier 1, Tier 2 only looks at your railway service. It doesn't look at any outside work, and you can think of it as your pension on top of your Tier 1 benefits. So let's make this real with numbers. Let's say we have a worker who has 30 years of railroad service. Their top 5 years of average monthly railroad earnings is $10,000 per month. So to calculate their Tier 2 benefits, we would take 0.7% multiplied by 10,000 multiplied by 30 years. This would give us a benefit of $2,100 per month. Next, we would add in their Tier 1 layer of benefit. This looked at a total of 35 years of work history, so including work outside of the railroad service, and we find that their benefit in this situation is $2,500 per month. Then we simply add their Tier 1 and Tier 2 benefits together and see that their total monthly benefit would be $4,600. A long-term career railroader may qualify for an additional supplemental annuity. Usually it's pretty small, somewhere in the ballpark of $20 to $40. Yes, it's small compared to the other benefits, but it does serve as an add-on for those who have lengthy service. So in this situation, our retired railroader would get about $4,600 a month for life. That's a pretty darn strong benefit compared to Social Security. Once your benefits are calculated, the next big question is, do they grow over time? The answer is yes. Both Tier 1 and Tier 2 get annual cost of living adjustments, but they don't increase at the same rate. Tier 1 follows the exact same cost of living adjustment as Social Security earnings. So every January, whatever percentage Social Security benefits go up, Tier 1 benefits go up by the exact same amount. Tier 2 does have a cost of living adjustment, but it's smaller. Tier 2 increases each year by 32.5% of the Social Security cost of living adjustment. So let's play this out and make it concrete with an example. We'll use our previous example where we had a worker receiving $2,500 a month in Tier 1 benefits, $2,100 a month in Tier 2 benefits, for a total of $4,600 a month. If Social Security receives a 3% cost of living adjustment, Tier 1 would go up the full 3%. So in this case, $2,575. Tier 2 would go up 32.5% of 3%, so 0.975%. In this situation, that benefit would increase to $2,120. So combined, the benefit goes from $4,600 a month to $4,695 per month, most of that increase coming from the Tier 1 side. So the bottom line is Tier 1 gets the full Social Security equivalent to the cost of living adjustment. Tier 2 gets a more modest increase. So over time, the goal is to help you to maintain your purchasing power, but just know that Tier 2 does increase at a bit of a slower rate than pure Social Security. Now, because I love examples and I really feel like they help to drive the point home, let's go over 3 different railroaders who have different lengths of service and different earnings within the railroad system. First, let's look at a career railroader, so 30 years and high earnings. This is someone who may have spent their entire working career with the railroad, getting those 30 years. These numbers are going to look very similar to our previous example, but we're going to add a layer here. Step 1, we look at those Tier 1 benefits, similar to Social Security. In this case, we'll say it's roughly $2,500 a month. We'll calculate their Tier 2 benefits. We add in that pension layer, plug those numbers into our formula. They have average monthly earnings of $10,000. This would come out to $2,100 per month. We add Tier 1, Tier 2 together. We get that their monthly benefit in retirement is $4,600. But let's add in a layer of nuance. Let's say this worker has a spouse who qualifies for spousal benefits. Their spouse may get an additional $2,000 or more per month. That puts the household benefit at roughly $6,600 a month. That's a very strong retirement income and likely a few $1,000s more than what Social Security income would have provided. Now let's look at a mid-career railroader. Maybe they did 20 years with the railroad and had more modest earnings. Let's say their top 5 years of earnings averaged $6,000 per month. So we plug this into the formula, 0.7% multiplied by 6,000 and then multiplied by 20 years of service, giving us a benefit of $840 per month. We also want to add in their Tier 1 layer, which looks at their combined work history. Maybe they qualify for $1,800 a month in Tier 1. We add these numbers together and we see that their monthly benefit in retirement would be $2,640. Now, this number might look a lot closer to what Social Security would otherwise pay, but we are getting a meaningful boost by having that Tier 2 pension layer added on top. And finally, let's look at a shorter service length. Let's say we have someone who did 10 years in the railroad industry and averaged earnings of about $5,000 a month. In this situation, their Tier 2 benefit would be about $350 a month. Now, since Tier 1 is based off both work that pays into Social Security as well as work that's paid into the rail system, it really depends on what this individual's work history was. If they had years where they worked in a career that paid into Social Security, this Tier 1 layer could be quite meaningful. If they only did 10 total years in the rail service and didn't have other jobs, this would reduce the Tier 1 benefit. So essentially, whatever their Social Security equivalent is would be their Tier 1 benefit, and then we would add in that Tier 2 pension layer on top of this. So in practice, even with a shorter service with the rail systems, you don't lose your pension, you just receive a more modest pension that gets layered on top of what your equivalent of Social Security would have otherwise been. Now let's talk about something really important, spousal benefits. Just like Social Security, railroad retirement provides benefits not just for the worker, but also for their spouse if they qualify, and in some ways, they're more generous. So the basic eligibility is a spouse can qualify if the rail employee is already receiving a railroad retirement annuity and the marriage has lasted at least 1 year. There are exceptions if there's a child of the marriage, but for most couples, the 1-year rule applies. Now let's talk age rules. Here's where things get interesting. Under normal circumstances, a spouse would be eligible to claim as early as the age of 62, but claiming prior to full retirement age means that you receive reduced benefits, just like Social Security. But, and this is important, if the rail employee qualifies under the 60-30 rule, meaning 30 years of service and retirement at 60, the spouse also gets to start at age 60 with no reduction. That is a big advantage over Social Security, where the spouse normally wouldn't qualify prior to the age of 62. And if the spouse is qualifying for a child who's under the age of 18 or disabled, they can qualify at an earlier age. Now, what would a spouse's benefit look like? On the Tier 1 side, the spousal benefit is generally up to 50% of the worker's Tier 1. On the Tier 2 side, spouses usually receive about 45% of the worker's Tier 2 benefit. Put those together, and this can be a fairly substantial monthly check, especially when you look at the household total. But there is important nuance here. If the spouse qualifies for their own Social Security benefit, meaning they've paid into the Social Security system through their own working career outside of the rail service, they don't get both the full Tier 1 benefit and their Social Security check. They go against each other, so it's an either-or situation. They essentially get the larger of the two, or if their benefit from Social Security would otherwise be less than 50% of their spouse's benefit, they would get a spousal top-up up to that 50%. The equivalent in the Tier 1 category. However, that Tier 2 spousal share is always paid on top no matter what that Tier 1 or the spouse's benefit from Social Security is, so that's why this Tier 2 layer is so important and so impactful. Now, just like the worker, if the spouse claims before full retirement age and continues working, the earnings test applies to Tier 1. If they earn above the annual limit, $23,400 in 2025, their Tier 1 benefit is reduced. Once they reach full retirement age, they can earn any amount, no earnings limit applies as long as it's a non-railroad position. Divorced spouses may also qualify, very similar to Social Security's 10-year marriage rule, as long as certain conditions are met. So let's do an example to bring this to life for spousal benefits. We'll build off our previous example where we had a worker who retired at 60 with 30 full years of service, and their monthly benefit was $4,600 a month. Now add in the spouse. At the age of 60, because of the 60-30 rule, the spouse qualifies too. They would get 50% of the Tier 1 benefit, in this case $1,250, 45% of the Tier 2 benefit, in this case $945. The total for the spouse would be a monthly benefit of about $2,195. Put them together, and this household is collecting around $6,800 a month, or nearly $82,000 a year. That is a powerful benefits package, especially compared to Social Security alone. Now let's tweak this example just a bit. Let's suppose that the spouse had their own Social Security benefit of $1,600 a month. In that case, they'd keep their $1,600 Social Security benefit instead of the $1,250 Tier 1 spousal benefit, but they'd still get the $945 Tier 2 share on top. So their total monthly benefit would be $2,545. All right, let's zoom out and look big picture. How does the railroad retirement stack up against Social Security? Railroad retirement provides noticeably higher benefits. Career railroad employees receive average annuities of about $4,300 a month. If we look across all rail retirees, their monthly benefit averages $3,450. Meanwhile, the average Social Security retiree gets around $2,000 a month. That's roughly half of what the rail workers are receiving. The spouses and widows benefit too. On average, railroad widows receive about $2,000 per month, compared to about $1,600 a month for Social Security. And a reminder of that 60-30 rule, where railroaders with at least 30 years of service can retire early and receive full unreduced benefits. That's not something Social Security allows. So what's the trade-off? Well, both you and your employer paid much more into the system during your working years. Tier 2 contributions, especially from the employer side, are far higher than the Social Security payroll tax. But for many railroad families, the return on those contributions, a higher monthly payout in retirement, stronger spousal and survivor benefits, and the ability to retire early make it worth it. Anytime we talk about pensions, people always ask, is it safe? Will it be there for me? The answer is yes. The railroad retirement is financially solid right now. The system manages about $29 billion in assets, which are managed through the National Railroad Retirement Investment Trust. And there is an important difference between this trust and Social Security. Tier 1 contributions are handled just like Social Security taxes. They're not invested in the markets, but they're used to pay current benefits to current retirees, and any excess is held in treasuries. Tier 2 contributions, on the other hand, are invested. Since 2001, this trust has invested into a diversified portfolio. So we've got stocks, bonds, real estate, even private equity. And in the long run, this has really played out well. The trust has a benchmark goal of an 8% long-term average return. So far, it's averaged a 9% long-term return. In 2023, it did a 12% net return, even after paying out benefits. But unlike Social Security, there's a built-in safety feature for the railroad retirement. If these assets ever dip too low, and that metric being 4 years equivalent of benefit payouts, they have the ability to make an adjustment. The employer Tier 2 tax rate can automatically increase up to as high as 22.1%. Employees are already paying their maximum amount of 4.9%. The employers carry the variable side of the funding. So this automatic adjustment would help to stabilize the system without waiting for Congress to act and do something. The only real risk would be a sudden collapse in railroad employment, but historically, when the industry has hit rough patches, Congress has stepped in to shore up funding. So right now, this fund is safe, stable, and secure, and it is paying benefits to over 500,000 retirees and survivors. The railroad retirement system is not Social Security. It's stronger in many ways. Yes, you pay more in during your working years, but you often get to retire early with higher monthly benefits and a secure pension layered on top of your Social Security equivalent. So if you spent an entire career or even just a handful of years with the railways, this system is designed to help support you throughout your retirement. Or if this is a career field you're looking at getting into, I hope this helped to explain it. If you have questions or comments, leave them down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. And remember, these are made before. I was going to say that. Your Tier 1 benefits will experience about a 30%, Hello, Canada. I love Canada. I grew up an hour from the border, so love Canada. If assets dip too low, those Tier 2 level, with the exception that if you have 30 years of railway service, I don't know. If you have 20 years of service or 10 years if you're already the age of 60, we're breathing through it today. It's a long one. I can't even begin to describe how long this one is. And that's after paying out $1.4 billion in benefits. You heard a train there. There was a big honk. I kind of want to leave it in because this is about rail workers.